Everyone, welcome to the Eat to Win show where sports nutrition meets peak performance. Get ready for expert insights, real stories, and tips to help you win with every meal. Let's dive in.
All right, welcome to the Eat to Win podcast. I'm Tavis Piattoli, co-founder of the company My Sports Dietitian and the Eat to Win app. And today we're here to talk about all things related to sports nutrition. Whether you're an athlete, you're just passionate about nutrition, this is the place to be. We have an amazing guest lined up for today that's ready to break down the topic on wrestling nutrition. But we're not just going to be talking about wrestling nutrition. We're going to talk about all the different challenges wrestlers face related to the nutrition. So let's jump right in. I want to give you a little bit of an idea of who we're speaking with. Today, we're speaking with sports dietitian Samuel Bullard. Samuel has 13 years experience in wrestling as a wrestler himself, but also he's incredibly passionate about helping wrestlers overcome the challenges of underfueling in cutting weight properly. He has an incredible program he's developed. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but a little bit of his background. He did his undergraduate work at Georgia Gwinnett College and also did his master's in nutrition as well as his dietetic internship at Georgia State University, where he was able to become a dietitian. He's been a dietitian now for over 3 years, and he's just been, again, passionate about working with the wrestling community. Samuel, it's great to have you here today. I'm really excited about learning some of these topics on sports nutrition for wrestlers.
All right. Thanks for having me, Tavis.
So let's dive into some key topics. First, there's a lot of misconceptions that comes around wrestling nutrition, right? And let's talk about what are some of those misconceptions that you see about making weight. Making weight's one of those things. I've working in wrestling myself, a lot of these kids are starving themselves and doing things improperly to try to make weight. So what are some misconceptions about making weight that you've encountered in the work that you do?
Yeah, it's really the prevalence of the starvation diet. I don't know how this happened for wrestlers, but everyone just became convinced that if I'm going to make weight, the best way to do it is just I'm going to stop eating and drinking until I make weight. So that's probably the most prevalent. It's one of the things I have to explain. And it really, the underlying aspect of that is they think that because when they're making weight, they think they're losing fat. That's how they think that they're making weight. So they think that calories are clearly the issue. And so I have to just not eat until I make weight. So that's kind of one of the first things I break down whenever I'm working with wrestlers is that's not how you're making weight. So you don't have to starve yourself. You can make weight and still eat plenty. It's great.
I'm just curious, you wrestled for a long time. Was that the mindset when you wrestled, and was that something that you were taught or just told, hey, this is what you got to do? Is that the culture of the sport?
I don't think anyone ever told you, but then when you looked at how other wrestlers, because I never wrestled in college, we're talking high school. So no one at that level is we're high schoolers, so we're not specifically talking about, let's break down the depths of nutrition for wrestling. It was kind of just like you looked around and saw what other people were doing as other high schoolers or how they're making weight. And that was the very common one is, I guess I need to make a little plate of food and it needs to get smaller and smaller the closer I get to making weight, even the thing you'll see is like people putting their food on a scale and then weighing that and okay, well, I can only eat this X amount of weight of food. So yeah, that's kind of what you looked around and saw if anyone was really trying to cut weight.
I remember in high school that, I played high school football. I was a tackle. I was 260 pounds at the time. And then you transition into wrestling season, and some of those football players moved into wrestling. And some of my buddies, they were played offensive line with me in linebacker and other sports where we eat for football. And then you see them going into, we called it the huddle. That's a place where we ate lunch at the school I went. And I'm like, why are you just snacking on celery and this and that? He's like, well, I got to lose 20 pounds in the next couple of weeks for this match. And I'm like, wow, that's got to be awful and exhausting. And I know we'll talk about that, but I'm sure you've encountered a lot of those things as well. Now, let's explain a little bit about why is wrestling more challenging than, let's say, other sports, especially nutrition for wrestlers? Because as I just mentioned, football, you just want to eat to perform, but wrestling's a whole different animal. So why is it more challenging for wrestling when it comes to your diet?
Yeah, it's the weight classes. Wrestling couldn't exist without the weight classes, but the fact that you have to be a certain weight at a certain time and then basically an hour and a half later perform at peak is kind of what makes it so nutritionally challenging. Is what do you do before that weigh-ins? What do you do after weigh-ins to recover? And then on top of all the normal athlete nutrition, which is how do I fuel and recover throughout the week. So it's just got that whole other layer because you have to make weight like that.
Yeah, I can't imagine, just some of those struggles of, and I've had some of my close friends, their sons now, they're always reaching out. Hey, what can he do to this? And he's got to lose 2 pounds by tomorrow. And I'm like, man, we're just waiting too long for all these things to happen, sometimes 5 pounds. And I know we talk about in our field balance. Balance is a very key word about, hey, you need to have nutritional balance. So how can wrestlers strike a balance between achieving their weight goals and also maintaining peak performance?
Well, I mean, the first thing is to not shoot for a weight class where you're having to cut too much weight. I mean, that's obviously easier said than done because you always have the team, call it team drama, where it's like, I want to be on the varsity, right? But there's this really good wrestler at the weight class I want to go. So do I go up? Do I go down? So there's always that tension there. That's often one of the reasons why people are, because they really want to be on the lineup, but there's someone's at their weight class. Yeah, I mean, not going for a weight class that's too far out of range is kind of one of the key areas, but sometimes you can't really help that. So
yeah, I've talked to parents and I'm like, what's your son's height and weight or daughter's height and weight? And they might say, well, he's 5'8" and right now he's 160, but they want him to get to 140. And I'm like, I start cringing. I'm like, no, that's not safe. But
yeah.
I know in some cases they're going to do it regardless. And like you said, they might have a kid in that weight class that's a senior and state champion, and he's not moving out of that weight class. And if you want to wrestle into another class, or you want to wrestle and just get on the mat, you got to move around and do some things that are challenging. So let's talk about how to do that, because if you're going to have to cut weight and then weigh in, and then you only have, I guess we'll talk about the time. What is the time frame? Let's say you weigh in that morning, your match. What's that time frame from when you have to wrestle? How many hours do you have, or how long is that?
So it's actually an interesting question, because college, they actually have rules about how long it is, because they used to not. And that was actually one of their key ways that they did to keep people from cutting too much weight, is they made a rule where you had to start wrestling within a certain time between weigh-ins. And what that did, essentially, it made it so that you couldn't cut extreme amounts of weight, because you wouldn't be able to perform at all, because you'd be still super dehydrated, because it takes a certain amount of time for your body to reabsorb that water. So I think that was a really smart rule. High school doesn't necessarily have that as hard as fast, but they generally hour and a half after weigh-ins. So it still does kind of limit that. You do have bigger national tournaments, though, especially for high schoolers, which I'm not a big fan of. Well, they'll have 24 hours in between weigh-ins and their first match. And so naturally, everyone there is cutting just ridiculous body percentages to get to that weight class. And then if you don't do that, then you're at a disadvantage. Like the big terms would be like Super 32 is the big high school preseason tournament where like a lot of the guys who are trying to get seen by college recruiters are going to go to. And yeah, I'm not a fan of the 24-hour window between weight. It's like a UFC fight. Like that's what they do. Like, and they cut ridiculous weights. Yeah.
Well, I'm just thinking, like, if you're wrestling 140, I'm just throwing out a number, and then you get to, like, let's say 139, 140, but then you have all that time, and like you might actually wrestle at 155 or 150 or whatever, all the water you're putting in carbs back in your system. So that's
absolutely, yeah.
But I'm sure both are doing that too. So it's not like one's going to weigh 150 and one's going to weigh 140. Let's talk about practical tips, right? So for those that are going to have to do that and then weigh in and then wrestle, what are some practical tips that wrestlers can do to recover from those weigh-ins and then fuel their body before a match?
Yeah, you kind of have to, it's interesting. You basically have to do the reverse of what you did to make weight, the right way to make weight. Because a lot of the weight change when it comes to wrestlers is actually water. So it's dehydration and rehydration. And it has to be very controlled, because extreme dehydration is very dangerous. But when you're losing 5 pounds in a day, when you're losing 6 pounds in a day, you didn't lose that much in fat. You lost all that in water. So that's kind of how I explain it, is when we're teaching wrestlers how to make weight and do it in a safe and controlled way, is you got to not cut too much weight is the first one. And then the second one is you got to rehydrate after that match, because that's the reason why you feel so bad. And that's the reason why. So we're looking at making sure you're getting some simple carbs in you, assuming we're not at a 24-hour tournament where we just lost extreme body weight. But so for like a normal high school tournament where you have basically an hour to turn around, it's something that you can absorb quick and easy. So we got electrolytes, we got carbs, and we got water. That's kind of where you start. And then protein, if you can not upset your stomach before your first match.
Yeah.
And please don't go to the concession stand and eat a fried chicken sandwich.
All right, let's get nachos and cheese after the game to go. Yeah, I can imagine their stomachs are so sensitive because they've not had a lot of food, and then you try to put all these calories back in, and especially and I know you said simple carbs, but sometimes I guess it just has to depend on the individual and what works for them, right? Like, don't try anything new. Try to make sure you take your time to restore some of that glycogen, and then put maybe some liquid in the system, because the last thing you want to do is get on the mat and your GI system's all messed up.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's kind of the hard side, is because that's very personalized. Like, some people can just absolutely eat and they're fine, and some people, they're like, if I eat that food, I will throw up on the mat. We're not doing it,
It's funny you say that, because I was just watching, I think, the first game in the NFL, they were wondering why the quarterback didn't touch the ball. The center actually threw up on the football, and they actually changed the play because of that, because he didn't want to throw it. I don't know, it was something kind of funny. Anyway, a different topic. All right, let's talk about mistakes. We know wrestlers make mistakes, and when it comes to nutrition, a lot of athletes make mistakes. But in your experience, what's the biggest mistakes that wrestlers are making when it comes to nutrition, especially during the competition season?
I'm cutting too much weight. It's so tempting because the most wrestlers have felt what it feels like to be heavier than their opponent. And that's an advantage. That's a real advantage. It's really hard for people who haven't wrestled to understand how much of an advantage it is to be heavier than your opponent, even by a couple pounds, because when it's just you against another person, that's an advantage all the way through the mat. And the more tired they get, that's a bigger advantage. However, the trap they fall into is they remember that feeling of, oh, I was so much bigger than my opponents. If I cut more weight, it'll be an advantage. But what will happen is throughout the season, if they cut like for a full wrestling season, they'll start shrinking. They'll start losing muscle. They'll get lighter. They'll get weaker, especially with more extreme weight loss. And so what happens is what was an advantage at the first time they did it at the start of the season ends up being they're weaker than a lot of their opponents when it rolls around to state, because they lost so much muscle because they were in a calorie deficit that entire 6-month wrestling season. And it's really easy to see because you can see a picture of them at the beginning of the season and at the end of the season, and it's very clear. Yeah.
I've heard stories where, state champions go in, they're number one seed for the state tournament, and then some of their nutritional practices cause them to maybe get third when they should have dominated because they were underfueled and just tired all the time. So that's unfortunate.
Yeah.
Now,
and there are ways to like prevent that. Like, it's not just, that's probably what that kind of happens when you have like probably the worst types of making weight strategies. You can definitely do it in a way where you're recovering and you're trying to eat in an optimal way. Like, you're making sure you're getting enough protein after every practice and you're recovering properly after every weight cut. So it's not that like every single person who cuts a lot of weight will just lose all their muscle, but it's definitely a risk.
Liquid Fuel is a new sports and hydration product formulated by a sports dietitian to give athletes the edge to train and compete longer. It contains the low glycemic carbohydrate palatinose, designed to keep blood sugar levels more stable to provide energy for 3 to 4 hours without the blood sugar crash seen in other leading sports drinks. Its unique 4-part electrolyte formula includes 50% of your daily magnesium need to optimize muscle function. Liquid Fuel is naturally sweetened, along with no artificial ingredients or colors. Currently being used by high school, collegiate, and professional teams, Liquid Fuel allows you to live life with the confidence knowing you're properly fueling your body. Visit drinkliquidfuel.com and use the code MSD10 to get 10% off your offer.
So would you give parents and like say of young wrestlers and young athletes, high school athletes, would you advise them to maybe, let's say they need to wrestle 10 pounds less than where they are, start that process maybe off season, summer, to where when they get closer to the start of the season, they're closer to their wrestling weight versus waiting to the last minute?
It depends. And this is why having the body composition is really helpful in making that kind of decision. Because if, let's say they have a body fat percentage of 17%, then yeah, slimming down before the season. But if we already have an athlete in the summer and he's 7%, 8%, if he's already a very fit athlete, that will actually be a trap, because he's going to start trying to diet in the summertime instead of trying to build muscle and maybe even going up to a weight class he could have gone to. And then he's going to roll around into the season and he's already been dieting for 2 months, and then he's got to wrestle for another 6 months. So it kind of depends. Sometimes it is good to give yourself more time, but sometimes it turns into almost like a diet trap. So
maybe those lighter athletes, those kids wrestling 100 or not in the 90s and the early 112s versus the heavyweight, the 240 or the 220 class, whatever that class is, maybe it's better for them versus the lighter ones.
Absolutely.
Gotcha.
It would, honestly, with any high school athlete, if I'm working with them over the summer, we're building muscle, we're getting strong, we're trying to just get better as a wrestler, because they already spend, if they do have to make weight, they already spend 6 months of the year worrying about their weight. So I try to honestly steer them away from that, because they're still growing. They don't even really know what weight classes are going to go in the summer, because they might hit a growth spurt and, grow 2 inches and 10 pounds, and they're going to be in a completely different weight class.
Let's talk about personalized nutrition. This is just in the whole industry, personalized nutrition is like the biggest craze right now. How do you approach creating a personalized nutrition plan for a wrestler, especially for different weight classes?
Yeah. So, we focus on habits, and really we start with like the basics. So we want to make sure we know the basics of just general athlete nutrition. So how do I recover after a wrestling match? How do I recover after wrestling practice? How do I fuel before wrestling practice? just so that kind of thing. And and that's really helpful if we can talk about that before the wrestling season starts, because if they do have to make weight, that's a whole nother layer of time sensitive nutrition changes that they're going to have to learn how to make. And so if we already have like a bedrock baseline of, I know what to eat before training, I know how to recover after training, then we can start talking about like the time specifics of what do I do to make weight specifically. Yeah, because there's almost like two layers. It's like, how do I be a healthy athlete? And then how do I make weight?
People like to hear success stories about what others. We know young athletes like to follow others and that have success when it comes to anything, whether it's nutrition, lifting. What are some of the success stories that you've had of athletes, of wrestlers that you've worked with who've improved their performance through adjusting their nutritional habits?
I've worked with a couple of good athletes. I usually don't share names unless I've gotten specific permission to share names. So, but I had one athlete who, he came into me, one of his challenges, he was actually at a boarding school. And so that challenge of being away from home and just trying to get the nutrition support he needed, it really made a big difference, I think, for him. And he ended up going on to wrestle at a D1 program. So he's doing big things now. I like seeing his post match, his hand getting raised. So
no, it's always good to follow clients you work with and see their success. That's a lot of fun.
Absolutely, yeah. And then there's just the wrestlers who, they come in and they're like not doing anything right when it comes to making weight, and after the first time they like we start implementing some changes of like, okay, here's how you really should be making weight. They're coming back and they're like, I had so much energy after I weighed in. I was feeling great and I made weight. I was like, yes.
And then they buy in and they're like, okay, now this stuff really works.
Yeah.
My old practices are not ideal. No, that's great. It's always good to have that kind of stuff. So that's good. Now let's talk about long-term health especially, we know the short-term potential risk of cutting weight and dehydration and performance. But if athletes continue to do this, let's say freshman year, junior, every year they're cutting and they're constantly putting their body under extreme deprivation. What are some long-term things that they need to be concerned about? Is there anything that could impact their overall health?
Well, increased risk of injury is always a big one, because especially if they put their body in starvation mode for 6 months, their muscles are not recovering. Their body's actually breaking down muscles so that they can get enough protein and amino acids to keep their body functioning. So injury is one of the immediate ones. Honestly, if they're in a growth spurt, they might stunt their growth. That's always a legitimate risk if you are really putting yourself under that kind of nutritional strain for a long period of time when you're supposed to be growing. That's a risk. And then the one thing I try to talk to wrestlers about is honestly mentality. So if you're going to be a wrestler, if you're going to be a successful wrestler, you need to be focusing on getting better. On every time I step on the mat, I believe I can win. And what I've noticed with wrestlers, and it happened to me personally as a wrestler when I spent my freshman year, my sophomore year cutting significant amount of weight, was my focus would change from, I need to be performing as best I can, I want to be on top of the podium during the state tournament, to I need to make weight on Saturday, and then I need to make weight after that. And it has the ability to steal your focus from I'm getting better as an athlete to I need to make weight, which it's hard to see at first, but it can be very detrimental long term if you spend your whole wrestling career doing that, as it really can steal your focus from what the really original reason why you started wrestling, which was not to make weight. It was like, I want to do this and I want to get better,
Yeah, that's great information. I think too, another thing would be hormone adjustments, lower testosterone, increased cortisol on the stress system. This is a lot of stress that puts the body. But I think you made it a great point, stunning growth. Like, I see these products now that are saying it's going to make the kid taller. I'm like, there's nothing you're going to take that's going to make that child taller, but there are things that they can do that's going to probably prevent them from seeing growth, especially not eating enough calories.
Yeah.
Now, supplements. We know a lot of kids may be trying to take things to cut weight faster or use products to stimulate metabolism or whatever that is. Mm-hmm. Is there a role that supplements can play, or what role do supplements play in a wrestler's nutrition plan, and which ones do you recommend to take or maybe avoid?
Yeah. So anything that says any sort of supplement that's marketed as a weight cutter, weight burner, fat burner, I immediately ask all wrestlers to stop taking, because a lot of times those are either not going to work or they're going to work and they're dangerous. But as far as supplements that I think are very effective for wrestlers, I think creatine for off season is great. So like if I'm working with a wrestler over summer, I'll definitely, and we're talking about building muscle and like putting on weight and maybe going up a weight class, I think creatine is absolutely great. Especially the fact that it can help minimize the impacts of concussions. So that's another whole benefit. And then another big one that a lot of wrestlers haven't heard, but I almost always recommend is beta-alanine. There's some pretty compelling research in the combat arena, sports arena, and wrestling definitely falls into that, where it being a muscle buffer can be very effective for the time periods and the intensity that wrestling brings. So that's a very common one I'll put wrestlers on.
Those are great. I mean, I believe there's actually a study that combines creatine and beta-alanine in wrestlers to show reduction in fatigue, which is, it slows the body's ability to reach fatigue, which those two combined is powerful. And I'm glad you mentioned fat burners, stimulants, because I think the last thing, and it's probably an athletic trainer's nightmare when they're at these events and they're worried about kids' energy drinks, stimulants. They're already dehydrated. Then you add something that's going to increase heart rate and blood pressure. And it's like, this is just scary. So I'm glad you mentioned those. All right, last question. As a sports dietitian, how do you educate athletes and coaches on really debunking some of these myths and things that they learn about just whatever they hear in the media from an influencer, but also how to educate them about proper nutrition?
I try to start with what they're interested in. I think that's just the way the human brain works is you can tell a person a bunch of information, but chances are the only piece of information that they'll retain is what they actually wanted to hear. So I usually try to start with what does that coach care about? What does that athlete actually care about inside of the nutrition realm? And I usually try to start there, because what will happen is we'll talk about it, they'll try to apply it, and then they'll be like, oh, this really worked. And then their ears are kind of a little more tuned. Like, let's see what else nutrition can really work. What else can impact them? So that's the way I usually think about it, is like, I could just talk about nutrition more than anyone wants to hear, but I usually try to focus on what they're ready to hear. What do they care about? What are they ready to apply almost immediately?
Sam, that's great information. I really appreciate you taking the time. This is just such valuable information that every coach, athlete, parent needs to learn more about, even sports dietitians. But I want to ask you a question that has nothing related to today. I want to do something fun, a fun exercise that we're going to do at the end of each of these podcasts. I'm going to call it the question of the day that's unrelated to this topic. And I like this question because I'm a music junkie. And I ask everyone this question: if you had to be the lead singer of any band today, the past, who would that be?
Lead singer of any band? I do not know. Honestly,
you can't say Backstreet Boys, because then
I honestly enjoy instrumental music a lot. Okay. I actually listen to it a lot. So I don't know. So a lot of my favorite bands don't have lead singers.
All right. So you'll just be a classical violin player.
There you go. Yeah. If I could suddenly gain the ability to play classical violin and play for some of let's say Two Steps from Hell is one of my favorite instrumental bands. So
okay, cool.
I could be a classical violinist somewhere in the orchestra. How about that?
Well, Sam, thanks so much for the time today. This was excellent information. Really appreciate your time. That's it for today's episode on the Eat to Win podcast. I want to thank Sam for joining us, sharing his expertise in everything that he knows about wrestling nutrition. If you found today's insights valuable, be sure to like, subscribe, and share this with your community. Stay tuned for more expert tips on nutrition and performance. And until next time, keep fueling for success.
Thanks for joining us on the Eat to Win show. Remember, every meal is a step toward victory. Until next time, stay strong and keep winning.